Session is on validity evidence and content and cognitive processes. We will be focusing primarily on academic assessments for this session, but if you do have questions about ELP assessments, the panel will try to address those too. Some of that is very new, and there is a session this afternoon on ELP assessments. So the panelists will be focusing on two critical elements that impact the validity arguments made by states in their peer review submissions. And specifically, they'll be focusing on the content validity evidence that is effective, as well as evidence of cognitive processes. This session will specifically address critical elements 3.1 and 3.2. And I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves.
I'm Angela Broadus. I'm history as a teacher and a test developer of alternate assessments and general assessments. And now I work in the area of preparing future elementary and secondary mathematics teachers.
Are you hearing?
No.
Good morning. I'm Ryan Kettler. I'm an associate professor in the school psychology program at Rutgers University. And I do research in universal screening and also in alternate and inclusive assessment. And I guess that's what I have to share.
I'm Tracy Hembry. I am a psychometrician. I have served as a peer reviewer for a number of years now, and I worked on large-scale state assessments for a number of years with a vendor. So I have experience on both sides.
Hi, I'm Will Laurier, and like Tracy, I also have a background in psychometrics. I have worked with various testing organizations, and have served as a peer reviewer on several peer reviews, and I'm currently in private practice.
Thank you. So we're going to start out by talking about validity in a general way, and for that, Ryan will start us off.
Okay, thanks, Susan. So, as Susan mentioned, our specific focus for the most part is going to be on 3.1 and 3.2 content validity and validity based on cognitive processes. But also embedded in the guidance under 3.1 is that reference to overall validity, which I interpret as being connected to construct validity, or the degree to which the scores that we're evaluating represent the constructs we intend for them to represent so that they can yield accurate and appropriate inferences and interpretations. And it's important that this is all included together because all of these types of evidence connect to at least our most basic inferences that we're trying to make, which is that the scores on the reading tests reflect students' reading, the scores on the math tests reflect students' mathematic abilities, and so on and so forth. So really that overall or that construct validity piece, at least to my thinking, is connected equally to 3.1 through 3.4. Those four different types of evidence that collectively build an argument for construct validity evidence. You're probably familiar with the phrase that all validity is construct validity, or all validity evidence is construct validity evidence, which is most connected to seminal writing by Samuel Messick a couple of decades ago. And it seems that the guidance is pretty well aligned to that with this point about overall validity and then the four different types that have their own critical elements. What's new in this area? Well, there is specific language. I'll read from the guidance. The state has documented adequate overall validity evidence for its assessments consistent with nationally recognized professional and technical testing standards. The best known, at least to my thinking, of these sets of standards are the standards for educational and psychological testing, which were revised a couple years ago by a joint committee of the American Educational Research Association, the American Psychological Association, and the National Council on Measurement and Education. Now, these standards in these four different areas are to be used in a thoughtful way to gather evidence to support the interpretations and the uses of tests. So it's not the case that they should all four be equally weighted in each case, but it is, at least to my thinking, important to try to collect evidence from each of these four because they do each speak to at least that most basic inference again, which is that reading score represents the reading construct, that math score represents the child's math ability, and so on and so forth. To meet those requirements, a really effective way on states' parts, and one of the examples that's included in the guidance, is to have a validity chapter in a technical manual on your assessments that addresses each of these 4 areas at a minimum, and also at a minimum indicates the uses, the interpretations, and the intended inferences from your tests. And the reason that is because building beyond that idea that all evidence is construct validity evidence is the idea that a validity argument should be built around those intended inferences, uses, and interpretations of the test. And this is a line of thinking that's most often attributed to Michael Caine, who also has written extensively in this area. And I think that it's important that not be used as a rationale to undermine any of those basic types of evidence, because each of those, the 2 that we'll talk about today, content, response processes, and also perhaps the better known internal structure validity evidence and relations with other measures, all collectively feed into that idea that the score is representing what it's intended to represent, and are necessary to support that very basic idea that the score represents the child's reading, the math score represents their math ability. But there are inferences and uses on the part of states, or that states often want to do, that go beyond just that most basic inference. And so Caine's argument that we should be building these validity arguments around intended inferences then would logically indicate, for example, if you're going to be evaluating teachers or school buildings or districts based on these scores, then evidence need not be collected only at the student level, which is often the case for reliability and validity evidence, but also at the classroom level or the building level to indicate that those average scores or median scores, however you collect them to represent your teachers and your districts and your schools, evidence be collected at that level. A second example would be if a growth score is being used, like a student growth percentile or a conditional growth index to evaluate students, then evidence should be collected, not just indicating that the before and after scores are appropriate, but also that growth index represents growth. So you would be collecting content, relations with other variables, all these different types of evidence to connect to that growth score. As a third example, if you're making the argument that scores from a reading or math test inform intervention in some ways, it would be best practice to start collecting evidence indicating that persons who have lower scores on specific subscales or on the overall reading or mathematics score benefit, or perhaps even benefit disproportionately to other students when they're connected to certain interventions. So this raises the bar, but it's really important that if you're going to be making inferences beyond the basic inference that reading represents reading and math represents math, that you start collecting evidence that indicates that the scores can appropriately be used for those purposes. So with that said, I'll hand it over to...
May I ask
sure.
the audience, do you have any questions for Ryan about the general concept of validity and anything that he has talked about? If there's any questions, you might want to take them now. Yes,
Yeah.
in the back?
Sue, it's a request. Do you think the speakers could stand at the podium? The way this room is set up.
Okay, yes, we can do that. Thank you. Sure. All right.
Steve?
Ryan, people are starting to talk about restructuring technical reports as validity argument reports.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen anybody try that yet?
In the states that I've reviewed, I'm thinking, I don't feel like I've seen that. So I've definitely seen states indicate like what their intended uses are and so on and so forth, but not following like the strict protocol that would be was laid out by Michael Caine. Yes.
Just housekeeping, is it possible for the panel to repeat the questions given from the audience?
Yes, we will do
It's a little hard
that.
to hear, actually.
Thank you.
Okay, that was just a question about whether or not I've seen validity chapters that have been built around the inferences argument, and I have not seen that to the extent that Michael Kane would have indicated in his writing.
And I'll just chime in that in my experience as a peer reviewer, I have not yet seen that either. I did work for a state that tried to put together such an argument, and I know that every time we presented it, the TAC gave us a lot of feedback about how to refine it, so.
Any other questions, general questions about validity? Okay, and we will
I'll come up.
have Tracy.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about critical element 3.1. So I'm going to draw from my own experience as a peer reviewer and from speaking with other peer reviewers about seeing evidence related to this element. For academic assessments, generally speaking, the way in which we have seen states provide evidence for this critical element is through alignment studies. I know a couple years ago, there was a couple questions from states about how many alignment studies need to be done. So I think we've heard now from the feds that for every test, there should be an alignment study. So that was a question a couple years ago. So for every test that you have, you should be conducting an alignment study. This is typically done by a vendor, not always, but typically it's done through a vendor. And you want to be sure when you're doing the alignment study that within your test blueprint, if your standards are not part of your objectives, if there's not a direct connection, the alignment study should be going not just from your items to the objectives, but also from the objectives back to the standards. You want to be making that connection between the items themselves, the content of the test, back to the standards. Okay, so that's definitely something that we've seen. One of the other things that I've commonly seen as a peer reviewer is that a state will submit evidence from their vendor. It'll be their alignment study. The vendor puts together a lovely report, and the state submits that, and then that's kind of the end of the evidence that they submit. So in my experience, I have never seen an alignment study where the result is that every item is perfectly aligned to the standards. I've never seen perfect alignment. If you have, good for you. But if you submit an alignment study and you don't have perfect alignment, then this would be a really good place in your submission to add some narrative in that index document about what comes next. So your vendor conducted an alignment study, and there were some places for which you did not have perfect alignment. Now, how is that going to inform the program moving forward? And so it's kind of the now what question that as peer reviewers we have seen unanswered and have provided states with some feedback about this is great, we don't expect perfect alignment in your studies, but what are you going to do with this study moving forward? So again, I know there's separate sessions about how to put together your evidence, but that's a really good place to utilize that index document and put some narrative in there about here's what we're doing with this alignment study, here's how we're going to incorporate this information moving forward, and how we're going to address the places where we didn't have perfect alignment. A couple other things that I have seen, particularly with adaptive assessments, is adherence to the blueprint. So if you have an adaptive assessment, we see tables about the percentage of students who received a test that aligns with the blueprint and adheres to the blueprint. It's the same kind of thing as the alignment studies. That's great. If you did not adhere to the blueprint for every student, then you need to address that in your narrative about what are you going to do moving forward. Again, at least in my experience with peer reviewers, the expectation is not necessarily perfection, but to provide the information that you have and then to let everyone know about what you're going to do, how you're going to incorporate that information to improve the program moving forward. So again, that question of now what? It's not simply submitting the evidence and all of your beautiful tables and graphs. It's about what are you going to do with that information moving forward. And then finally, robustness of the item bank. So again, this may be more pertinent for adaptive assessments, but, you know, some evidence that your item bank can support the blueprint and the design of your assessments. And just like everything else, if it does not adhere perfectly, if it's not as robust as you would like it to be, what development efforts are you undertaking to meet those requirements moving forward? So those are the big things that I've seen when it comes to alignment studies, is really not just supplying the evidence that your vendors have provided for you, those nice reports, but taking it one step further and letting the peer reviewers know, we think that we've met this, or we think we've mostly met it, and here's what we're gonna do to meet the requirements moving forward. Questions? Sure.
You made reference to the fact that a vendor does the alignment study. That vendor is not the test developing vendor, correct? We're looking for an independent look at alignment, and I just wasn't hearing that and wanted to know if that was your intention to clearly communicate.
Yeah, typically the case, the question was about whether or not the vendor that does the alignment study is independent. Typically that is the case. So yes, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah?
Are you, or is one of the panelists going to address the new requirement for standards to a standards alignment for the ELP assessment?
So our intention was not to talk about the ELP in this session, just because that's new. So we were drawing primarily from our experience in regards to the academic assessments. So we haven't yet seen evidence to those. So I think some of the other sessions will focus on those.
There will be an ELP assessment section, and you can ask those questions there.
So, is there a best time recommended to do your alignment study? Do you do it before you do your final forms, or is it generally done after you already have your operational test forms?
So the question is in regards to the timing of the alignment study, whether it should be done before or after assembling the forms. Is that right?
Yes.
I don't think as peers we have any kind of set rules about when it's done. I think having worked with states as part of a vendor, it really depends on the schedule and all of the other moving parts that are going on. So I don't think that the peer reviewers or that the guidance has set rules about when that goes on in the process. Yeah, Tracy.
A number of students are not performing on grade for a particular grade level. So you might have a 5th grade student in reading who begins an assessment and then through the CAT determines this student is not meeting standard at grade level. So proficiency level wise, they could be given a level 1 or whatever the does not meet standard is for that grade. At that point, is it appropriate to route students into items that are lower grade level so that teachers and parents could get information about what a particular student does know at that grade level?
Sure. So I'm going to repeat the question just to make sure everyone heard it. The question is about basically off grade level testing. So if you have a student who is performing at either a lower or a higher level, you've determined their proficiency level for that grade level, is it appropriate to administer items off grade level at that point?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so Dawn, correct me if I'm wrong, because there was a lot of questions in peer review panels about off-grade level testing. My understanding is that the guidance requires that proficiency levels are determined based on grade level content.
Yes.
Once that determination is made, then items can be administered beyond that, but that the proficiency level has to be based on grade level content.
I believe that's what our guidance says.
Okay, sure. Sure, Jan?
And I think the question about when alignment studies should be conducted is an important one, because I think the question about when alignment studies should be conducted is an important one, because it goes to what the comment that we just heard about off and on grade level. In the past, when we've looked at, and of course this is affected by cats and that sort of thing, I think there is more confidence in alignment studies that are completed on intact forms. And the reason for that is to be sure that students are getting sufficient number of items at the proficient level to determine whether or not they are proficient at grade level. Now, with CAT, that becomes more complicated because you have an item bank. And in some instances, peer reviewers have said, show us some evidence that all of the students are getting at least some items at the proficient level for grade level, so that they at least have had the opportunity to see those items and attempt them, and that all students have that opportunity. So that's affected a lot how CATs have been structured. In most cases where students at least some items, their first items are at proficient, and then they go down or up. But in terms of alignment studies, the evidence piece I think is really important to make sure that the state can provide evidence that all students have had the opportunity to attempt proficient level items. Yeah, it's in the revenue statement.
Was there a question, or was that just a comment, Jan? Okay. Other questions?
Tracy?
Yeah.
You want to address the issue of grade level, that every grade as well as every test?
So, in case it wasn't clear, my comment about having an alignment study for every test, so for the academic assessments, that's going to mean every grade level and all content. So that's what that was intended to mean, in case that wasn't clear. No, it's okay.
Thank you, Tracy. Angie.
Hi. So there are additional considerations for alternate assessments when it comes to critical element 3.1. The main one is to insert that additional requirement that the alternate assessment achievement standards are aligned to the adopted standards for the state. So that can be done through a set of extended standards, which is helpful to practitioners, but creates an additional validity step because all of the links need to be clear to a reviewer. So that would be a point to note. Another consideration for alternate assessments is to ensure that the students, the items students receive are aligned to the appropriate grade level, meaning the assigned grade level of that student. And that argument needs to be clear to the reviewers. Tracy mentioned that for adaptive tests, generally, reviewers seek to understand how each test adheres to the breadth and depth of the standards. Well, for alternate assessments, I'm sorry.
That's right.
For alternate assessments, the issue is breadth and reduced complexity. So reviewers seek information about how the state describes the alternate assessment in terms of ensuring breadth and how the state has reduced the complexity to be appropriate for students in the population. Are there questions about that before I move on to 3.2? Otherwise, alternate assessments need to comply to 3.1 in every way Tracy described. So I'm going to start off talking about cognitive processes, and then Will is going to help me at the end, or second half. I first want to say I am not alone in saying how hard it is to provide evidence for this critical element. I think every phone call I was on this summer, we discussed how difficult it is to show that items evoke the intended cognitive processes. So that's kind of a caveat for everything that comes next. The guidance does describe 3 ways or 3 suggestions for supplying evidence for this critical element. The gold standard is cognitive labs, but they are both expensive and difficult for a myriad of reasons. The ones I have seen as a peer reviewer have been very brief, meaning few students and few items. So the breadth of the assessment program there was not evidence of the breadth of the assessment program having been studied in this way. So that would be one thing to consider, to make sure that that states supply evidence describing how a good number of items operate with a nice sample of students from different grades and content areas. But we also brainstormed during the phone calls about other ways that students might, or that states might provide evidence related to cognitive processes. So other forms of evidence can include, sorry, I'm confused between my paper notes and the slide. Think aloud studies, analyses of incorrect response options, or sometimes called distractor analyses, surveys of students after tests, time spent on items, skipping patterns. All of these are they're available to us in different ways with online testing than they were with paper and pencil testing. So it's maybe a good opportunity to consider some additional sources of evidence. One of the very important, I mentioned that already, substantial sample of items from all content areas, all grade levels. And as Tracy mentioned for 3.1, at the end of all of this, a good discussion about how this information will inform the assessment program is very important to the review process. So if items are drawing on the intended cognitive processes, perhaps that item template maybe gets populated more, or if they're not, maybe some adjustments. But in any case, a discussion of how the findings of investigations into cognitive processes will inform test development. One of the recommendations that came out of our conversations was the evidence-centered design process recommends item templates. I don't know if they're always called item templates, but families of items that kind of hang together and are proposed to do the same thing. So it may be that states or programs study an item template or one or two samples from that item template to avoid over-studying one type of item. That might be a way to reduce costs while getting kind of more bang for your buck. The second type of evidence noted in the guidance is expert judgment. And this is very common. We see many reports of panels having looked at items and judged them on either Bloom or Webb's scheme. And the note here is to please consider supplying evidence that describes the committee membership, both demographics and the expertise of the different members. Believe it or not, we actually do pull up those long Excel sheets and we look through and they have this many teachers and this many parents, or whatever the makeup is. But supplying the description of the panel membership for those types of reviews is very helpful. And the third type of evidence that is useful for cognitive processes is to look at the relationships between the responses to some items, and other variables that are useful for comparing, for example, a student's ability to think mathematically. Are the teacher reports saying the same thing? But looking at relationships among variables is another way you can describe what the cognitive processes are that are evoked by certain families of items. And again, the big point is, please supply evidence that shows how the state is considering findings of such studies to inform test development. Do you have any questions for me? Oh my goodness. Okay.
I'm Antone from Washington State. So in your expert judgment, you talk about the Bloom's or Webb's schemes. What other schemes have you seen or are being used for the next generation science standards who don't fit well into those cognitive models?
I've pretty much seen DOK in my personal experience. Has anyone else seen other?
Have a lot for science.
That's a good consideration because they go into multiple things at one time. That's right.
So I just want to add something that in the guide, we consciously do not endorse a particular alignment model or approach. That's intentional because there's, I think, multiple approaches to assembling this evidence. We have peer reviewers who sort the submission to see if it's a reasonable set of evidence given what the requirement is. So you just won't see that in our peer review guide where we say you must use alignment method A or B. And I know sometimes I've gotten the perception from states that that is the case or has been the case, but as we're conducting peer review now, it is not. So there's, I think, multiple ways to assemble strong arguments, and I think our peers try to accept all of them. So. We'll let you talk.
Sorry, Derek. No. Yeah. This is Gary Cook. As a peer and someone who's written on alignment, I have a particular opinion about alignment, but if there's a reasonable methodology and a reasonable set of arguments, that's appropriate. So I don't think one way or the other, Webb, surveys of enacted curriculum, achievement, whatever. I think the idea is if you have a reasoned approach that looks at depth and breadth and a reasoned methodology and reasoned folks doing it, and it's independent, then in our view, that's appropriate.
And I'll just kind of second Gary's comments that as a psychometrician, I may have preferred methods, but as a peer, I try not to go into it with expectations about it has to be done in a specific way. Having worked with the state at a vendor, I know that there are lots of different characteristics or considerations that come into how and why you do certain things. And so the key is to pick something that makes sense for your program and then to explain that as well. This is what was chosen and here's why.
My name is Harold. I'm with AIR. Some of these studies are easy to do with data, and if they don't work with the peer review, we can redo them pretty easily. Some studies are harder to do, like the cognitive labs or consequential validity, and they're a big commitment. And one of the concerns that I've had about the peer review process, and I wonder if there's consideration for states submitting a proposed design for what they intend to do, have that receive feedback from the peers, and if the study is done with the fidelity as described, then it would receive approval. And you can't guarantee approval, but my concern might be a state would invest millions in cognitive labs and then receive feedback that it didn't do what the peers had hoped for. So is there any consideration for some proposed designs being submitted, receiving feedback? And that wouldn't work for all things. Not every validity study is expensive. Not reliability studies are very inexpensive. But some of these can be quite timely and expensive. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I don't know what they are either. That's a good question. I think if a state had those concerns, they should probably come talk to us. I just really don't know how to answer that.
I would also go back to what I started with, that as peers, we acknowledge how difficult it is to provide this evidence. So what we're offering today are suggestions, but every review I've been part of has had a conversation about how just very difficult it is. So.
Hi, Eric from California. And the question I had actually was, you made a reference to teacher reports, and I don't know what you're referring to. Are you talking about specific reports on a student by a teacher in a specific area? pertaining to a certain type or family of items or content, or are you talking about a report card? I just don't know what you're talking about.
I was referring to the paragraph in the guidance that it's the, wait one moment.
Page 41.
Right. For academic assessments, other measures that require similar levels of cognitive complexity in the content area, e.g. teacher ratings of student performance on performance tasks. So I can see it happening where I give some multiple choice questions and then I give some, maybe they're pilot questions, and I give some open-ended responses and I look at those together. I don't know if that would be a teacher or a test developer. I have a split identity, but that's how I can see that playing out.
And then on the last point, it would be really good to see anywhere from anyone exemplars of what a good cognitive lab report looks like. Because in my experience, I haven't seen one.
Alice, what is a good cognitive lab report like?
Well, I think that definitely sympathetic in terms of like my research, even outside of this area, looking at like different types of reliability and validity evidence. And as Angela alluded to, it's not just in this area, but in any area, this 3.2 based on response processes is some of the most costly evidence to obtain. A good cognitive lab, one thing I want to say is that it doesn't have to have, at least from my perspective, is a large number of participants. So unlike your internal structure validity evidence or your reliability evidence that may come from your entire sample, I'm just personally looking for a representative sample across like grade levels, disability statuses, and such. And I would also say, and again, this may be my perspective as a university professor, that you may be able to partner with a local university where ed psych or special education students are looking for data in order to do theses or dissertation projects. I think that that might be a good way to get some of the person power moving forward in terms of doing this, if you can get, if that's okay in terms of your protocol for sharing information and such. I do think, from my view, with the helpful list like that Angela shared with you of all of the different ways to provide this data. The Department of Education doesn't want to be prescriptive. I do think that cognitive labs are the gold standard, or maybe surveys directly after tests, asking kids, what were you thinking about during this item and that item. Those other forms of evidence, such as distractor analysis, or recording the amount of time, or perhaps teacher ratings of how a person would have to respond to these, those are less costly forms of data to get, and they can fit in this area to my thinking. However, you have to have a pretty nuanced argument for showing how those connect to validity evidence based on response processes. It can't be just we examined the degree to which various distractors were selected. I'm wanting personally to see that the different distractors on a multiple choice item were connected to different ways of thinking about a problem. And if a distractor was selected a very small amount of the time, does that mean that it's not an effective distractor that's just working as advanced reading load, or is this identifying somebody who's thinking in a particular way? That's just to give you an idea of the level of nuance. So I do think there are two tiers here. One set of evidence that's very clearly related to validity based on response processes, and then sort of another tier of evidence that could be, but you do have to make that argument if you're using that other type of evidence.
Any other questions on cognitive processes evidence?
I'll continue talking
Will?
about them.
Yeah. Thank you, Will.
Ask me if wow, there's so much space over here. Okay, so what I wanted to, what I'd like to talk about is a question that Don had raised about the sort of the organization of these sessions. Is what do we think are one of the biggest challenges for states in this area, given our experience as peer reviewers? And I think in this critical element for 3.2, the one of the most difficult things is to think about it critically and very thoughtfully, because cognitive processes refers to something very specific. You can look at standards, which Ryan had mentioned, the standards for educational and psychological testing. There is a section there on evidence based on response processes, and it's very clearly laid out what that evidence may consist in, and more importantly, when it's applicable. So I think for states, for people submitting for peer review, what would be helpful for us is to see where you think cognitive processes are applicable, and specifically what those cognitive processes are, so that you're investigating them in a very focused manner. And there's two senses of cognitive processes that I've seen in the best technical reports on cognitive processes that are sort of combined, but I think both of them need to be addressed in some programs. One of them is the sense of cognitive processes that we all understand, which is some sort of reasoning that the student is reasoning or applying their knowledge and skills in a certain way in order to respond to this type of question. So we're looking for evidence that they've been reasoning or following a certain process for this type of item, because that reasoning or that process is implied in the standard. So if a standard implies that, that's when you investigate cognitive processes. Now there's another sense of response processes that are also addressed in the standards, but later on, and that has to do with the format of an item. If the format of an item is new or atypical, you want evidence that the students understand the instructions to the item, are sort of internalizing those instructions, and are not responding to the item in a way that's inconsistent with those instructions. So, for example, I've seen cognitive labs, not in the context of peer reviews, but in different contexts, where students may be responding to a multiple choice, multiple select item. That's an item that looks like a multiple choice item, but can support more than one answer, where they're responding to it as if it is a multiple choice item. So struggling between options to determine, well, which is the correct one, when both of them may be correct. So that's also evidence that you can get in a cognitive lab, which is related to response processes, but it's not specifically the cognitive process. It's not specifically about the cognitive processes in your standards, but it still is important evidence to justify your program. So it could, fit into this critical element and possibly some others. So I'd just like to lay out just a few questions, four steps, for addressing cognitive standards that I think may be useful. One is, and I mentioned this earlier, just survey your standards to see where you're implying cognitive processes. So take a look at them and see which ones actually imply cognitive processes. Then identify the cognitive process. What is the cognitive process or processes for which you are seeking evidence? Then what observable student, ask yourself the question, what observable student actions or statements would provide that evidence? Maybe it's something that you can ask right after they take the item or a set of items. And how are you going to create the conditions to elicit those actions or statements if the students are indeed following the cognitive processes that are implied in your standards? So that's all I have. Questions?
Any questions for Will?
I don't need a mic.
Okay.
I'm a little confused, other than, my knee reflex. I think everything on this test would require a cognitive process. Could you explain to me this triage you're talking about and looking at my standards and what is a cognitive process and what is not a cognitive process? You're guessing is not a cognitive process? What's not?
Well, if the standard is about an outcome or a product specifically that the student can do this. And it's not addressing a way of, a manner in which that outcome comes about, or a specific cognitive process, specifically in the standards, then there is no evidence of cognitive process would not be relevant. I have an example actually from the standards. Maybe your content standards don't have standards of this kind, but there is one example here. In some cases, multiple response processes are available for solving the problems of interest, say in a mathematics context. And the construct of interest is only concerned with whether the problem was solved correctly. As a simple example, there may be multiple possible routes to obtaining the correct solution to a mathematical problem. It may be that the standard only addresses the solution of that problem or being able to do that problem, and it isn't really focused on cognitive processes.
That was a tautology to me.
If you have say a mathematics problem where you're only interested in that the student is able to do it, but there are many different ways of doing it, and you acknowledge that, then you're not specifically investigating the process, right? The single way in which they've solved it. You're only interested in that this is something that they can do, that may not, cognitive processes may not be saying that. Of course, they're using cognitive processes to solve the problem, but your inference about the test score does not involve any specific cognitive process.
Much clearer, thank you.
Any last questions for Will on that topic? We'll hear. Angela?
I just want to add one thing that's very related to what we just talked about. When you think about cognitive processes, it's important to study whether accommodations erode the intended cognitive processes of a set of items. So that would be something that would be very interesting to look into. And does it erode it beyond the intention of the accommodation and so forth? Susan, oh, no, sorry. No, not really. Susan asked me to make a comment about alternate assessments with regard to cognitive processes. And the standards for reporting whether the intended cognitive processes are evoked remain the same, but collecting evidence from that population is just even more difficult. So I don't have a lot of recommendation there. I just have a lot of acknowledgement of how difficult that remains. Alternate assessments.
That's where, I guess to me, it's difficult either way, but I would especially say with that group, that's where instead of having them think aloud about what they're doing while they do a performance task or something, asking them immediately afterward is one of the things I would suggest.
Or teachers. That would be a really great population where teacher ratings could be useful in the argument.
So lastly, in the interest of keeping an eye toward overall validity that's subsumed under 3.1, we'll get a little bit of bonus material in this session. I'm going to talk just briefly about critical elements 3.3 and 3.4 and what I've seen that has worked well or could work better in sort of completing those 4 types of evidence for an overall validity argument. Internal structure, validity evidence, so that's getting at whether the various pieces of a test fit together and work together in a way that would be predicted by the underlying theory of the test. So thinking about how those numbers and operations items and geometry items and algebra items fit together to contribute to a mathematics score. And what works well is, regardless of whether you're using exploratory factor analysis or confirmatory or just looking at the correlations among subscores, what I'm really looking for personally is, does your underlying theory for how the different parts of a test fit together match how they actually fit together? So do each of those subscales contribute to the overall score, or do they not? What I've seen that could work better or causes confusion, at least for me as a peer reviewer, is if I'm seeing a underlying theory that doesn't match the evidence or doesn't match the reporting structure at the end, thinking about some of those elements in 6. And so the example would be if a state is putting forth a unidimensionality argument so that it's really around that math score, that reading score, and not numbers and operations and algebra that feed in, or comprehension and vocabulary that feed in. But then at the reporting stage, wanting to report subscales. And if what you've had all along is doing unidimensionality tests and you've showed these subscales are very highly correlated, that really undermines the argument to eventually go ahead and report subscale scores. So that's one example of what could be done better, just that alignment, if you will, among the theory, the structure that's seen, and also the reporting on the back end. In terms of relations with other variables, that's building your evidence, showing how well your scores relate to, whether it be a correlation or agreement indices, those other scores that they're supposed to relate well to. And what I'm looking for, a lot of this evidence typically reported as correlational, although we do have agreement indices and kappa and so on and so forth. And what I'm piecing together from the validity manual and the technical reports and such, looking at the magnitudes of those correlations, at a minimum, I'm looking to see whether it meets the requirements of a basic multi-trait, multi-method matrix, which is if you have, let's say, a criterion measure, oftentimes that's like an interim assessment, brief assessments in like mathematics and reading. It works well if your two math scores, so your summative math score from your achievement test that you're having evaluated, correlates higher with your interim math score than it correlates with the reading score from the summative assessment. In other words, we want to see those coefficients be higher within construct across measures than they are within measure across constructs. And so the flip side of that is, if I'm seeing higher relationships among your interim math and reading score than I'm seeing between measures for reading or between measures for math, then that becomes problematic, because that's starting to show that these scores are being driven more by the method and the time of testing and what the assessment is, rather than being driven by the construct that they're measuring. Any questions on those areas before I open to general? Steve?
So Ryan, I like your multi-trait, multi-method example. How much higher is high enough for peer reviewers in general?
Well,
I know those are funny questions.
It really depends on the assessment. So we see more trouble, I guess, getting that break apart. More trouble is seen in terms of isolating the construct from the source if we're talking about an alternate assessment versus the general assessment. But at a minimum, I'm just looking to see that the actual coefficients are higher within construct than they are within measure. Because sometimes, especially with the alternate assessments, that's not the case. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Maybe just a thought.
Sure.
Peers to consider from the state perspective. From the psychometric perspective, we understand the challenges of reporting subscale scores, but then using a unidimensional test. Peers have to remember sometimes they work with unidimensional models because that's the way it's always been done. And unless they report subscale scores, their state client or their state folks will just be unhappy. And you just have to do it. So hopefully the peers wouldn't look at that and say, well, this completely invalidates the idea of using. There are very practical reasons why people do these things to work through the political complexities within their state.
Right. And I appreciate you pointing that out. I was somewhat sensitive to that, but yeah, definitely. So you're making the point that the unidimensionality argument has been used to develop these scores. We know that the reading and the math scores are the ones that have the highest stakes that are connected to them, and yet there's a strong desire for subtest scores. And so we definitely are sensitive to that in terms of when we're looking at it as reviewers, and also when those subscales correlate, and I'm talking about like above 0.8, 0.85, then I do have to look at them and wonder, I do tend to look at them and wonder, we're telling the people by giving these subscale scores that they measure different things, but it really doesn't look like it. And so I think it'd be good if we can all keep moving in the direction of connecting those relationships to the theory and the reporting structure.
I'd just like to add something, and this is probably one of those things where I have to put a big asterisk and disclaimer, it's my opinion, but I don't think anywhere in the guides, in the guidelines, it implies that the score that's reported has to be based on a unidimensional scale. So you may use a unidimensional scale for assessments, but I don't think there's anything preventing you from using a multidimensional scale or scaling subsections of the test separately and providing a composite. That might be more in line with the structure of these programs, which is to provide an overall score and have subscores that in themselves are reliable and also provide independent information. The requirements for subscores in our standards, right, in the standards for educational and psychological testing are actually tougher than the requirements for scores. They're the requirements for scores plus the requirement that they be distinct from each other and distinct from the total score. So it's really a very hard thing to have if you start with a unidimensional scale overall and then try to have subscores. But again, that's just my opinion, it's a way of I think it's a way of dealing with this need to have a total and useful subscores that actually do provide additional information.
So, as usual, Harold made a very good point. And the way I would translate what he said was, you might add in the peer review submission a comment about the practical need for reporting subscores, even though you've made an argument based on a unidimensional model. I also heard two comments, recommendations from Tracy and Angela regarding saying things explicitly to peer reviewers. So is it persuasive to peer reviewers when you actually talk directly to them about ways that they might, why you've done a particular thing, even though it's a little bit out of line with the guidelines? I'm not sure that's the best way to, does it help to actually talk to the peer reviewers in your submission?
So I will echo Will in putting a disclaimer that this is my personal opinion. And the short answer, I would say, Steve, is at least in my experience, yes. In that index document where you can put a narrative in there, having some kind of rationale to acknowledge, we didn't directly adhere to the standards or best practice or whatever, seminal literature you want to refer to that's relevant. And here's the rationale why we diverged from that. And then to say something along the lines of, something that would be helpful is to say, and this was presented to our TAC who approved it on this particular date, right? Because then as peer reviewers, we know that you recognize this difference. We would have done it this way if we could, but the world isn't perfect, and so we couldn't do it in this perfect way, and we're still making a best effort. And so I think the short answer, at least from me, Steve, is yes, but again, that's my opinion.
Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
This is a question, I'm going to let you off the hook, Ryan. This is a question for Angela.
Okay.
Because she made the statement earlier about the use of accommodations, which I found intriguing because from a validity standpoint, some accommodations may not be faithful to the construct being measured in whole or part. Other elements require full and meaningful participation and, full inclusion, and everybody gets to show what they know using I guess the term I'd use is a primary mode of communication, whatever, scribing the composition, reading a reading test or a literature or language test, whatever. So how do you reviewers come down on that argument? Because they're in diametric opposition to each other, it seems to me.
I don't recall having a conversation like that because we don't get to see the test. We
you read the
review
accommodations
documentation,
policy.
so it's really a consideration that a state might think about when they're designing a test. But I have not personally reviewed any documentation of how a state tackles that seeming contradiction.
It's not how a state tackles it, it's how reviewers rate it or cite it. Have reviewers cited states that use accommodations that in some way change part of what the construct is designed to measure?
I have not convened on a panel where I observed that.
Yeah, I think that in my view, we don't in these critical elements get to reviewing on that level of like what state-specific accommodations policies are. It's more looking at and thinking about like 6.3, the guidance that's necessary around like accommodations and accessibility features. Sorry for that. And so I haven't seen stuff at that grain size either.
Okay. Phoebe? Phoebe?
I'll just yell. I can do that. I have run across places where we've had a discussion of allowing reading on the reading test, or read aloud on the reading test. And what the state does is they provide a rationale for doing that. They say their reading standards are not at a certain grade level. The reading standards are not about decoding, they're about comprehension. And if that this is the way the student comprehends written material in the classroom, that's what we want to know about the student. So they tie it into the construct about what inference they want to make about the student. So sometimes accommodations can not only erode the construct, but sometimes it actually allows you to measure the construct at all. And I think we need to keep both, and the peer reviewers typically do keep those both in mind. And sometimes it's a matter of, is it better than not giving the accommodation? I mean, the easy one is giving a test, a math test in English to someone who does not at all has ever read English or not getting a measure of math. So is an accommodation, that's an easy one though. Does an accommodation allow us to actually get the student's math ability? The reading on the reading test is the biggest one that I've encountered as a peer reviewer. Or as a TAC member, I can't remember. Probably both. I don't know.
I was going to say, ask, is there Virginia in the audience? I thought Virginia had done a study of, is Virginia Shelley Loving Writer? Oh, didn't you all do a study of the effect of accommodations on your reading test?
Yes.
You did.
We did do a study looking at allowing a read aloud for students with disabilities
Mhm.
and how that compared to students who did not have a read aloud, and use that as justification for allowing that for very specific students.
Did you all hear that, or do you want me to say it again? Good.
Might be interesting to explain, how you did this study and what.
We looked at the mean scale scores of students with disabilities who had a read aloud, and then compared the mean scale scores of students who did not have a read aloud, and found very little difference. So that was the justification we used for providing the read aloud for very specific students. These are students who have an identified issue either with decoding, or they either have a visual impairment and have not yet learned Braille. So it is very specific students.